do we eat bacon and eggs for breakfast? Why did the lunch lady in high school have to wear a hairnet? Why do men wear wristwatches instead of pocket watches? And why was it taboo back in the 1920s and 30s for a woman to smoke in public? I'm glad you asked those questions. I'm going to try to provide the answers because most of the answers stem to the fact that it was a public relations campaign. Edward Bernays is the father of public relations, and he engineered all of those scenarios I just shared with you. Now, Edward Bernays understood that people do things for certain reasons, and we all have our reasons. But why do we do what we do? Once again, it's probably stemming from a public relations campaign. Now, Edward Bernays was from Europe, as was his uncle. His uncle, you've heard of him, was the great psychologist Sigmund Freud, and they helped each other out. So Bernays would translate Uncle Sigmund's research from German to English. And in the meantime, while Edward was researching the information and transcribing it, he started to understand how the public's unconscious psychological motivations could be applied to a new field of study, public relations. So the businesses and corporations in this country are always trying to get you to do something. They want to convince you to buy whatever it is they're trying to sell. And Edward Bernays combined this information for his clients. So what he started to do was, he said, well, I'm going to use my favorite approach. And his approach was this: get someone else in authority to say it's a good thing, and then people will do it. So that was the best way, in his mind, to control the public's attitude about things. So what he did was he would find someone who could influence a group. And once you found that person who could influence a group, that person became an expert. And the expert convinced other experts, and then the public would usually go along with it. That worked most of the time. I'm going to tell you about 4 of Edward Bernays' projects. He had millions of them, but we'll focus on 4 of them, and then I'll give you some tips on things you should look for when you watch a commercial or get social media, things like that. So number 1, bacon and eggs. Why do we eat bacon and eggs for breakfast? Believe it or not, during the early part of America's century, people didn't even eat bacon and eggs. They ate hot coffee and some toast. Or they might have eaten a piece of bread and some hot tea. So Bernays got a new client. And his new client happened to be the largest producer of bacon in North America. So he had to come up with a way to get people to buy more bacon. Bacon, bacon, bacon. That was his theme. So he decided to do a survey. And with this survey, he asked people, what do you think is a good thing to eat for breakfast? They said, oh, whatever. They gave different feelings. But then he interviewed 5,000 doctors. And the doctors said, bacon and eggs is the best thing to eat for breakfast. Who else would you get advice from when it comes to what's a good thing to eat but a medical doctor? So it turns out that 9 out of 10 doctors, this is the 1920s, he was using the phrase, 9 out of 10 doctors think this. You still hear that phrase on commercials today. So he put out a news release, it hit the newspaper, and people start buying and eating bacon and eggs for breakfast. Number 2, hairnets. The lunch lady wore a hairnet. back in 1975 when I was a student here at Princeton High School. You didn't see her without a hairnet. So this stems from another campaign by Edward Bernays. Edward was hired by the hairnet company, one of the largest in the country, because they wanted to increase the sales of hairnets. It was already proven in many states that you had to wear a hairnet if you worked with food in any kind of way. But in comes this celebrity, a movie star, who decided to stop wearing long hair and cut her hair short into a bob. It was all the rage. Beauticians around the country couldn't get to all the appointments that people wanted to make so that they could get short hair. The bobby pin makers started laying off workers at the factory because since women didn't have long hair as much as they did in the past, that meant they didn't have to make as many bobby pins. So the hairnet industry was in trouble. So Bernays hired some safety experts to come out with a new mandate. And the mandate said that if you work in a factory, you should wear a hairnet because your hair, no matter how long or short, it could get caught in machinery and you could get hurt. And then he got some nutritionists to say, now listen, if some hair falls in your food at the restaurant and you eat it, it can be totally contaminated and you're gonna be in deep trouble. So people listened. And the hairnet industry was brought back to life. But over the years, even though some states mandated hairnets, that didn't stay. So it's not really required anymore. Why do men wear wristwatches? Your great-grandfather would ask that question because there was a time when the only people who wore wristwatches were women. How did a man know what time it was? He had a pocket watch. And he looked at it, and that's how he knew what time it was. But why would men suddenly start wearing wristwatches? It was a public relations campaign. Edward Bernays was hired by a major watchmaker, and they wanted to increase the sales of watches to men. So they hired actors like these two guys, Paul Newman and Cary Grant, and they hired cowboys, Roy Rogers, and they even, at the movies, my dad tells me, he'd go to the matinee, and when you saw the cowboy movie, in between it was a newsreel. And in the newsreel, they had cowboys wearing watches or doing something. They were advertising something. So cowboys, rough guys, and then he took it a step further. Bernays made a deal with the federal government so that every soldier, when he was issued his supplies and his duffel bag, guess what was in that duffel bag? A watch. So a tough soldier now wears a watch. The actors wear watches. The cowboys wear watches. And men wear watches today. Why do we do what we do? It was probably a public relations campaign. So here these guys, they're synchronizing their watches. They're making sure everything's on time. And this is the stopwatch that people used many years before. This is Edward Bernays. So his uncle was still there for him, and he was using a technique. His favorite technique when it came to manipulating public opinion was to constantly get another authority to say that this is a good thing to do. And that would influence an entire group. So they continued that approach. Well, Bernays did. Here's our bacon again. That's crisp. That's the way I like it. And the hairnets and the stopwatches. So the last campaign was cigarettes. Women could not smoke in public, believe it or not. You considered it wasn't ladylike for a woman to smoke in public. So he was hired, Ed Bernays, hired by a tobacco company, the largest one in the country, and he hired 50 debutantes and some models to take part in the Easter parade in downtown New York City. And they marched in the parade, and he told them, I'm going to give you the cue. And at a certain time, you are going to light up your cigarettes. And then he contacted the media with a news release and said, I think these women are going to do something strange, but I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know what's up with it. So the media was there. the women lit up the cigarettes, and voila, more women were smoking, more women were buying cigarettes, and it made life easy on the tobacco company. Who's drank out of a paper cup before? Why do you drink out of a paper cup? Couldn't you just take the regular cup, rinse it out, and drink again? Oh no, this was a public relations campaign because a certain company hired Edward Bernays, and they said it's more sanitary to use that. Now, I want you to understand that these are some of the reasons we do the things they do, but these are techniques you can use to prevent from falling into that trap. What you see on commercials is jump on the bandwagon. That's where they'll say, everyone else is doing it, you should do it too. The second one is the testimonial. Joe Celebrity and Jane Celebrity are doing it, so if it's good enough for them, just do it. It's good enough for you. And then the expert says, the experts say, 9 out of 10 doctors say you should do this or that. So why we do what we do is usually a public relations campaign, and think again before you make a move. Thank you.